Hey everybody, welcome to Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy. Avengers Endgame is a reward. It was made for fans like you and me, people who've spent years obsessing over every detail and clue hidden in these films. In a lot of ways, the movie is one big Easter egg. So, get ready. We've got a lot to go over. And of course, there are big spoilers ahead for Avengers Endgame and every other Marvel movie ever made. The first line of the movie, while Clint is training his daughter, is, "You see where you're going? Now let's worry about how you get there." This is a meta comment for the MCU. Marvel has been planning their interconnected universe before Iron Man was even released. So they had this massive plan, they saw where they were going, but they never let that stray their focus. They concentrated, for the most part, on making good movies first and tying them together second. So they were always worried about how they would get to the end and the kind of stories they would tell. Also in this scene, Clint calls his daughter Hawkeye, the first time this code name has been heard in these movies, except for a very brief throwaway line in the Avengers.
Where's Agent Barton?
The Hawk.
Notice Hawkeye has an ankle monitor, just like Scott's in Ant-Man and the Wasp. Both heroes are under house arrest following the events of Civil War. When Clint's family disappears, you can hear thunder in the background, just like in Wakanda and Titan back in Infinity War. Then we hear the song Dear Mr. Fantasy by Traffic. The lyrics go, "Dear Mr. Fantasy, play us a tune, something to make us all happy. Do anything, take us out of this gloom." Now this is very appropriate given the way we all felt after the end of Infinity War.
I don't feel so good.
But it's also what these movies are trying to do for us, to help us forget our troubles and live in fantasy for 3 bladder-filled hours. The song is playing on the Benatar, meaning it was either from Peter Quill's Zoom or one of his awesome mixes.
300 songs?
Tony is playing paper football with Nebula, and this is a great character moment for her. She was trained by Thanos to be ruthless and competitive.
As a child, my father would have Gamora and me battle one another in training. Every time my sister prevailed, my father would replace a piece of me with machinery.
And that even applies to games that we played in middle school. In Tony's message to Pepper, he says, "Don't post this on social media." This is a tongue-in-cheek reference to a very outdated reference in the first Iron Man film.
I don't want to see this on your MySpace page.
And Tony records his message for Pepper with his helmet, which is a callback to Iron Man 3. Tony has been stranded in space for 22 days, and this is the 22nd film of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Tony is basically ready to die at the beginning of the movie, and he does go to sleep. And this is one of many ways the film will foreshadow his eventual death, like when Ant-Man gives him a heart attack later on. He calls Nebula a blue meanie, a reference to the villains from the Yellow Submarine. In that film, the Beatles, who were referenced in Infinity War,
The Avengers broke up.
Like a band? Like the Beatles?
travel in a magical craft through different realms, including the Sea of Time. When Tony is working on the ship with Nebula, he's wearing a black tank top, just like when he created the Mark I Iron Man armor from the first film. And in his message, he tells Pepper,
It's always you.
this is a callback to when he made Pepper CEO of Stark Industries in Iron Man 2.
It's you. It's always been you.
After Captain Marvel rescues the ship and they return home, Nebula and Rocket share a tender moment. They wordlessly hold hands, similar to when Drax comforted Rocket after Groot's death in Guardians of the Galaxy. And speaking of Rocket, his new costume is from the Abnett Landing Guardians comics, which inspired James Gunn's version of the team. When the Avengers reunite and take stock of the dead, we see several people didn't survive the snap, including Eric Selvig. After Tony arrives home, he's even more pissed at Cap than he was at the end of Civil War. He quotes a few lines from Age of Ultron,
I see a suit of armor around the world.
then he quotes this exchange almost word for word.
How are you guys planning on beating that? Together. We'll lose, and we'll do that together too.
He tells everyone that he had a vision, which is another callback to Age of Ultron when he saw the Avengers dead as Thanos invaded Earth. He calls Rocket a Build-A-Bear, and later we'll call him Ratchet of the Ratchet & Clank video game series. At the start of the movie, Tony is almost reverting back to how he was before he became Iron Man. He's cynical, he's arrogant, and he only wants to live his life for himself and his family and not the rest of the world.
To peace.
Thanos retires to the garden, and this fits nicely with the many religious symbols in Infinity War. In that film, Thanos becomes a god and rests on the 7th day, and the last line of the movie is even,
Oh God.
there are numerous references to gardens in the Bible and in other religions. They're often a place of eternal reward, rebirth, or paradise like the Garden of Eden. When the Avengers go to space, the honeycomb matrix that appears is also seen in the Guardians of the Galaxy films. On that trip, Cap wears his old suit from the Winter Soldier and looks at his Peggy Carter compass from the first Avenger. The Thanos scarecrow in the garden is straight from the comics, and this shot is a direct reference to the classic film Christopher Robin, and also Gladiator. Gladiator's main character, Maximus, is a lot like Thanos. They're both warriors who dream of retiring to a peaceful life on a farm. When Nebula says that her father's not a liar, this is actually supported by a line in Infinity War when Thanos tells Gamora,
But I never taught you to lie.
So the Avengers attack Thanos, and with the benefit of hindsight and the YouTube channel How It Should Have Ended, they slice off his glove to immediately end the threat. Then, finally, Thor goes for the head. Then we get to see the full aftermath of the decimation. Co-director Joe Russo has a cameo in this scene as the first openly gay character in the MCU. Also, one of the men in the meeting is Jim Starlin, who created Thanos and wrote most of Marvel's biggest cosmic stories. The movie's turning point is when Scott returns from the quantum realm, thanks to a rat randomly hitting buttons. And it's weird to think that the fate of the universe depended on this rat. Maybe in the 14 million other futures that Strange saw, the rat just didn't quite hit the exact sequence of buttons. The security guard is played by Ken Jeong, who directors Joe and Anthony Russo worked with on the sitcom Community, where he briefly played a security guard. His castmates, Jim Rash and Danny Pudi, also appeared in previous Russo Marvel movies, while another Community vet, Yvette Nicole Brown, will appear later in this film. Along with Joe McHale and Donald Glover, nearly every member of the Greendale Seven has appeared in a Marvel movie. Anyways, the guard is reading a novel by J.G. Ballard, who is famous for writing post-apocalyptic novels. Next, we go to the Avengers compound, where Black Widow is monitoring world security with help from Rocket, Okoye, Captain Marvel, Nebula, and Rhodey. They communicate with the same hologram technology that we saw in Winter Soldier. Carol Danvers has a new haircut, which is straight from the comics page. Before she heads off to do space stuff, she shares a look with Rhodey and tells him to be careful. In the comics, these two were an item, and they seem to be implying that there's some kind of spark here. Now, I wonder if these two Avengers that both have military backgrounds will appear in her sequel together. Then Scott Lang shows up in Luis's van from the Ant-Man movies, complete with the La Cucaracha honk.
Whoop, sorry, my bad.
He tells them that time works different in the quantum realm, which was actually set up in Ant-Man and the Wasp.
And don't get sucked into a time vortex. We won't be able to save you.
When they go to recruit Tony, we see that he's made good on his promise from Ultron.
Maybe I should take a page out of Barton's book. Build Pepper a farm. Hope nobody blows it up.
His daughter, Morgan, was named after a dream he had before Infinity War.
Last night, I dreamt we had a kid. We named him after your eccentric uncle. What was his name?
Right.
Morgan.
But also, there's a Morgan Stark in the comics, who is Tony's jealous cousin. When we first meet Morgan, she's wearing an Iron Man helmet like this little scamp in Iron Man 2. Years later, Kevin Feige would confirm the fan theory that this kid is actually a young Peter Parker at the Stark Expo. The team is trying to get Tony to go along with their time heist, which is the title of a Doctor Who episode.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
It's an appropriate reference since this movie includes a lot of timey-wimey stuff. When the team members go over the rules of time travel, they directly reference Back to the Future 2, saying don't bet on sporting events or meet your past self. But Banner throws a little shade at the movie and says that time travel doesn't work that way. But then Endgame directly copies the plot of Back to the Future 2, with teammates sneaking around themselves in the past and causing more problems by accidentally giving the villain the secret of time travel. In both movies, said villain disappears. And we're actually going to cover how the time travel mechanics in Avengers Endgame work in our next video, so don't worry about that for now. Then we have a kind of montage of getting the team back together, similar to the Blues Brothers.
We're putting the band back together.
Then we meet Professor Hulk, a concept taken from the comics. In Peter David's longtime run on the book, he introduced the smart Hulk who had Banner's intellect. Banner's journey to accept this Hulk half was alluded to in Infinity War.
Hulk, we got a lot to figure out, pal.
Bruce says that he once saw the Hulk as something to be cured, which was his goal in The Incredible Hulk. When Scott's age starts to go back and forth, it could be a callback to this scene in Ant-Man and the Wasp when he poses as a child to sneak out of Cassie's elementary school. Tony decides to invent time travel after he sees the photo of him presenting Peter with the Stark internship certificate. But that photo is directly behind a picture of John Slattery as Howard Stark, who will appear later in the movie. Morgan tells Tony that she loves him 3,000 times, which is a thinly veiled product placement for the Iron Man 3000 inversion table. I mentioned earlier that Tony kind of regresses back into his pre-Iron Man persona of not caring about the world. He says he wants to rest, but Pepper says he won't be able to. Remember, in Iron Man 3, he literally couldn't sleep after the Battle of New York. All through the movie, Tony is talking about sleep and he's talking about his dreams. This is another theme that will continue to foreshadow his death. When Cap and Tony finally reconcile, it's beside Tony's sports car. Remember, when these two technically stopped being teammates, Tony drove away in a very similar car. When he presents Cap with the shield, the theme from First Avenger plays. One of several musical callbacks in the film. Tony says he made this for you, referring to Howard Stark first making the shield for Steve Rogers. Then we travel to New Asgard, set to the King's supersonic rocket ship. This song is about a ship that's a refuge for people who aren't hip and where there's no suppression of minorities. The Asgardians escape on a supersonic rocket ship of their own at the end of Thor Ragnarok. Now they've created a new refuge on Earth.
It will become a haven for all peoples and aliens of the universe.
This also happened in the comics, when Asgardia came to Earth floating over a small town called Broxton in Oklahoma. Norway was an appropriate choice for the gods to settle because that's where the Norse legends originated, and also because Odin suggested it.
This could be Asgard.
Then we get one of the biggest surprises of the movie. Thor is rocking a Jim Hopper-style dad bod and looks like Rob Zombie. Tony even calls him Lebowski, a reference to Mr. Lebowski.
I am not Mr. Lebowski. You're Mr. Lebowski. I'm the dude.
Thor has had a harder time coping with failure because he's always been defined by his arrogance.
Thanos is just the latest in a long line of bastards, and he'll be the latest to feel my vengeance. Fate wills it so.
But later in the film, his mom tells him that failure is more important than success.
The greatest teacher failure is.
Meek and Korg are also there playing Fortnite together. Not only is Korg played by Taika Waititi, he's even dressed like the Thor Ragnarok writer-director. Clint is going around the world killing criminals who deserve to die. His new costume is straight from the comics when he became the vigilante Ronin following the events of Civil War. Also, the Yakuza member that Hawkeye kills is a character lifted from the comics. Then Natasha saves Clint from this life just as years ago he saved her.
Agent Barton was sent to kill me. He made a different call.
Again, there's a lot of characters coming full circle in this movie. Then the heroes plan their time heist after spending a lot of extra time recapping Thor: The Dark World, because that's one of those Marvel movies that no one really remembers every detail of. Basically, Natalie Portman gets Kool-Aid trapped inside of her. And by the way, the photo they show of Jane is the same we see in the Avengers, when Coulson writes her out of the movie with a single line.
Asked to consult there very suddenly yesterday.
While they plan, the team eats Ben & Jerry's ice cream, a callback to Infinity War.
And I swore off dairy, but then Ben & Jerry's named a flavor after me, so...
Stark Raving Hazelnuts.
Not bad.
Did any of you notice what the flavor was? If you did, let me know in the comments below. Before heading through time, the Avengers put their hands in a circle. This is similar to this cover of the New Avengers. These are all members of the Marvel Illuminati agreeing to use the Infinity Stones to reassemble the Infinity Gauntlet. Or it could also be a reference to the origin of the Fantastic Four when they banded together for the first time. During the Battle of New York, the Ancient One is fighting off aliens. This moment is a cool retcon for all the fans who wondered why the Wizards didn't help out during the Chitauri invasion. The answer is they did help, just secretly. In 2013 Asgard, we see Loki in his cell tossing a cup in the air, which of course was featured in the movie, and we see Natalie Portman taking a nap. Natalie Portman returning to the franchise is a pretty big surprise because she was unhappy with the studio after they parted ways with Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins. So she was hastily written out of the movies.
Sorry to hear that Jane dumped you.
In Endgame, we see her getting up, and then Rocket kind of appears later and says, "Hey, I got it." So I'm wondering if they deleted the sequence where he takes the ether from her, or if this was just unused footage from Thor: The Dark World. Either way, Portman came to the Endgame premiere, so there are apparently no hard feelings. Thor's mom Frigga has a lot to do in this movie. She barely had any lines in the Thor films. So it was nice to see Renee Russo get a moment to shine in the MCU. She asked Thor what's wrong with his eye, which is a reference to... When Clint and Natasha are flying toward Vormir, they can't help but smile at how awesome this is. He tells her this is a long way from Budapest, a callback to the Avengers.
Just like Budapest all over again!
When 2014 Nebula is fighting, you can see Chitauri Leviathans flying around outside. Present-day Nebula's memory is entangled with her 2014 self. In Ant-Man and the Wasp, Scott and Janet's minds were joined together through quantum entanglement. Back in 2012, present-day Tony is standing near the team as they stand over Loki. Past Tony distances himself from this seriousness by saying, "I'll pose up a storm later." He makes fun of Cap's Avengers-era suit, just like Tony did.
Of the people in this room, which one is A, wearing a spangly outfit, and B, not of use?
Then Brock Rumlow, who will eventually become Crossbones, appears to take the scepter. He's with fellow Hydra agent Jasper Sitwell. The Hydra agents name drop Dr. List. He's Baron von Strucker's chief scientist, who we saw studying Loki's scepter in Age of Ultron. When Captain America steps in the elevator, we're expecting a callback to this scene from Winter Soldier. But instead of fighting, he outsmarts the Hydra agents by telling them, "Hail Hydra." This is also a callback to a very recent controversial comic story where it revealed that Cap was originally a Nazi agent. Loki turns into Captain America, just like he did in Thor: The Dark World, and then we see how he got his gag from the end of the Avengers. Then Robert Redford makes a surprise cameo as Secretary Alexander Pierce, secret Hydra leader, and he tries to take the Tesseract. When Cap fights himself, he says,
I can do this all day.
which is the closest thing he has to a catchphrase.
I can do this all day. I can do this all day.
Also, Steve has really loosened up over the years. He went from calling out Stark's cursing
Language.
to admiring America's ass. When Tony jumps off Stark Tower, it's very similar to this scene from the Avengers. Banner talks to the Ancient One after she knocks him out of his body like she did Stephen Strange. This is where she explains how time travel works in the movie and that they are basically creating alternate timelines when they change the past. This is actually in line with the comics. Traditionally in Marvel books, whenever a character time travels, they create an alternate universe. As we all know, messing with the timeline is dangerous.
Temporal manipulations can create branches in time, unstable dimensional openings, spatial paradoxes, time loops.
But they really should put the warnings at the front of the book. Back in 2014, Thanos calls the Avengers unruly because that's what the other called them in the Avengers mid-credits scene.
They are unruly and therefore cannot be ruled.
Back on Morag, we see the Guardians opening title sequence from a slightly different perspective. Instead of a fun musical opening, we see a dipwad singing into a lizard. Rhodey is worried about booby-trapped spikes with skeletons stuck to them, a reference to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Then Tony and Cap travel back to 1970, where we get our very last Stan Lee cameo. The famous co-creator is playing an angry peacenik type with a "Nuff Said" bumper sticker. This was one of Stan's famous catchphrases that he used in the pages of Marvel Comics. The base Cap and Tony travel to is Camp Lehigh, where Steve was first trained in First Avenger and that was destroyed in the Winter Soldier. Cap's shirt has the name Roscoe on it, which is named after Roscoe Simons, who was briefly Captain America while the hero relinquished the title to become Nomad. In the SHIELD base, Tony pulls out an MIT visitor badge, which he would have obtained for his MIT lecture in Captain America Civil War. Note the old SHIELD logo on Tony's blazer. When he runs into his father Howard, he's looking for Dr. Arnim Zola. Zola was Red Skull's chief scientist, but later he joined SHIELD but was secretly working for Hydra all along.
What?
He was last seen as an AI in the Winter Soldier. Now Tony has always had daddy issues because his father seemed cold and distant. These issues have been hinted at in past movies.
I never got to say goodbye to my father.
My greatest creation is you.
But here he sees a lot of himself in his father. He's a scared man trying to do his best for his kid and for the world. When Howard leaves the base, he's driven by Jarvis from the Agent Carter TV series. The AI Jarvis that later becomes the Vision is named after this character, Tony's childhood butler. Then we see young Hank Pym with a retro Ant-Man helmet. When Cap sees Peggy's desk, there's a framed photo of him that we saw her hold at the end of First Avenger. It's great that she loves him for him, not just his muscles. Well, maybe a little bit his muscles. When Natasha and Clint go to Vormir, the Red Skull gives them the exact same speech that he gave in Infinity War, making me wonder how many times he's had to say this. The heroes fight, just like in Captain America Civil War.
We're still friends, right?
Depends on how hard you hit me.
Before Natasha sacrifices herself, she makes it clear that she owes Clint for seeing a hero in her instead of an assassin. It's okay, she tells him, a lot like Vision's comforting words to Wanda in Infinity War.
It's all right. You could never hurt me.
One of the reasons the heroes lost in Infinity War was because Thanos was willing to make sacrifices and they weren't.
We don't trade lives, Vision.
But in this movie, the heroes win through self-sacrifice. First Natasha and later Tony. Later, when they're arguing about who should use the reassembled gauntlet, Thor says he's the strongest Avenger, a callback to Ragnarok.
Strongest Avenger.
Access denied.
Strongest Avenger.
Before Banner puts on the gauntlet, he says the stone's radiation is mostly gamma. It's like I was made for this. Now this goes all the way back to the Avengers.
She's throwing off interference, radiation. Nothing harmful, low levels of gamma radiation.
That can be harmful.
Remember, Bruce was recruited to help the team because he's an expert in gamma radiation. Before the snap, Tony uses a hollow shield, similar to what Agent Coulson used in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. When Hulk puts on the glove, it burns his arm. Tony wants to shut it down, but Cap says to wait and asks Banner if he can handle it. This is very similar to the experiment that first gave Steve his powers.
I can do this!
After Thanos attacks the compound, Hulk holds up the rubble with everyone pinned underneath. This is a reference to Secret Wars #4. Then Thanos' ship, Sanctuary 2, is suddenly in orbit around the Earth, and you have to ask yourself, why didn't Thanos just launch a full-on invasion in Infinity War? I have my thoughts, but I want your theories. Tell me in the comments. Why did Thanos hold back? Then as the big three are facing Thanos, he tells them that he's now decided to wipe out all of reality and start again. This is more in line with the Thanos from the comics, who's simply a nihilist who wants to destroy all life. Then the battle starts. And honestly, this is 40 minutes of glorious fan service fun. At one point in my notes, I actually wrote the words, "so happy." So let's get into it. During the battle, Thanos tries to push Stormbreaker into Thor's chest, the reverse of what happened in Infinity War. When Cap wields Mjolnir, it's my favorite moment of the film. This has happened in the comics, but the MCU hinted at it in Age of Ultron. Thanos breaking Cap's shield is taken from the Infinity Gauntlet comic book, and also from Tony's vision in Age of Ultron. When all seems lost, Cap is about to face down all of Thanos' forces, reminding me of Luke in The Last Jedi. But then, we hear Sam Wilson say,
"On your left."
A double callback to the Winter Soldier.
"On your left."
And then, Doctor Strange sling rings everyone into the battle from all corners of the universe. And by the way, Stevie Strange can teleport armies across galaxies and presumably can shove the Hulk out of his body. He's officially the strongest Avenger. Well, maybe Captain Marvel. I don't know, who do you think is the strongest Avenger? Let me know in the comments. The battle kicks into gear when Steve finally gets to say the Avengers battle cry, Avengers Assemble, which was teased at the end of Age of Ultron.
Avengers!
The Wakandans show up, complete with Shuri, M'Baku, and Okoye. They repeat the war chant we heard in Infinity War. And then there are multiple Wakandan warships in the battle that we saw carrying weapons to other countries in Black Panther's climax. Then there's the Asgardians, there's Valkyrie on a Pegasus, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Ravagers, and all the wizards Baron Mordo hasn't killed yet. Then there's the Wasp, and Pepper Potts shows up as their comic book alter ego Rescue, and Giant Man punches the Leviathan. Basically, the last fight is like all of your toys and all of your friends' toys together for one big battle. There's so many great moments in this fight. There's Drax stabbing a monster in the back like he did the Obelisk in Guardians Volume 2. The Wasp tells Steve, "We're on it, Cap," after mocking Scott for calling him Cap in Ant-Man and the Wasp.
Matter of national security, the Cap needed help.
Cap?
Captain America, Captain.
Tony gives Peter a hug after giving him this fake hug in Spider-Man Homecoming.
It's not a hug, I'm just grabbing the door for you. We're not there yet.
And later, Spider-Man will activate his instant kill setting from that movie.
Activating instant kill.
At one point, Cap will call Peter Queens, a callback to this moment from Civil War.
Where you from?
Queens?
Brooklyn.
In this battle, everybody gets a hero moment, but no one's as bigger than Captain Marvel. She takes down Sanctuary 2 and turns the tide of the battle. When she appears, you can briefly hear the theme from her movie. Wanda gets to face off against Thanos before every female hero gets a moment of their own. Then Thanos calls down the artillery on his own people like King Edward and Braveheart.
Won't we hit our own troops?
Yes. But we'll hit theirs as well.
At the battle's climax, Tony tells Thanos, "I am Iron Man," a callback to the moment that kicked off his career.
I am Iron Man.
After Tony snaps his forces away, Thanos sits, just like he did at the end of Infinity War, before he also gets dusted. When Stark dies, Peter is standing over him, a reverse of his own death from Infinity War. And by sacrificing his life, Tony finally proves Steve wrong.
You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play, to lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
Pepper tells Tony that he can rest now, a callback to the sleepless nights he had in Iron Man 3 after the Battle of New York. Then, at his funeral, Tony's recording says, "If you told me a few years ago we weren't alone in the universe, I wouldn't have believed the extent." This is another meta comment to Nick Fury's introducing us to the shared universe in the first Iron Man movie's post-credits scene.
Mr. Stark, you become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
Back then, who would have thought that this little superhero movie about post-9/11 militarism could grow into such a weird, sprawling epic? Laying at the center of his wreath is Pepper's gift from Iron Man, the arc reactor that says, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart." The funeral is attended by almost every Marvel hero and supporting cast member. Thunderbolt Ross from Incredible Hulk and Civil War is there, and so is Aunt May. Everyone at the funeral is pretty easy to place, except maybe for Harley Keener, Ty Simpkins' character from Iron Man 3.
Cold. I can tell. You know how I can tell? Because we're connected.
Nick Fury is standing over the proceedings because he's kind of the godfather that first brought all these characters together. Wanda tells Clint that Natasha knows that they won, and she says they both know. She's referring to Gamora, who was also sacrificed to obtain the Soul Stone. This confirms that both Nat and Gamora are in Soul World, a pocket dimension inside the Soul Gem. We see Gamora there at the end of Infinity War. Now Wanda knows this because of her connection to the Infinity Stones. Happy Hogan, played by Iron Man director Jon Favreau, gets a nice moment with Morgan. He tells her that her dad liked cheeseburgers, which we know is true from Iron Man. Thor goes off to join Guardians of the Galaxy, which is hopefully part of James Gunn's Volume 3 script.
You're imitating the God-Man. It's weird.
No, I'm not.
I can't wait to see Chris Hemsworth cut loose in a full-blown comedy with these guys. The name he drops, as Guardians of the Galaxy, is an actual Marvel comic. And finally, Steve going on his final trip through time to return the Infinity Stones and Mjolnir. Steve tells Bucky, "Don't do anything stupid until I get back." That line and Bucky's response are from this scene in First Avenger.
Don't do anything stupid until I get back.
How can I? I'm taking all the stupid with you.
And when Steve transports the stones to the past, he carries them in a briefcase, just like the Tesseract was originally carried in a briefcase when we first saw it in the Thor post-credits scene. Then, old Steve Rogers appears, just as he did in the Marvel Comics. When he gives Sam the shield, we also hear the theme from First Avenger briefly play. Sam was once Captain America in the comics, but in this scene, Bucky nods to him. This is a way to acknowledge that Bucky was the replacement Cap in the comics before Sam. Steve gets his dance and a happy ever after with Peggy. But there are lots of other questions. Where did the shield come from? Did Steve just chill out while world events happened? And what will happen in Marvel Phase 4? We're going to answer all of these questions in the next few days, so be sure to subscribe. And let me know your favorite Endgame moment in the comments below. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.